A single warship that can take on an entire fleet, Captain. Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the TDF Indomitable, staring at the massive screen in front of her. Red dots filled the display like angry stars. Each dot was an enemy ship. There were over 200 of them heading straight toward Earth. "Captain, we're getting reports from the outer colonies," said Lieutenant Marcus Webb, his voice tight with worry. "The hegemony fleet destroyed everything in their path. Our entire defense force is gone." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. She had known this day might come. The hegemony had been conquering worlds for thousands of years. They had technology that made them nearly unstoppable. Their ships were massive, their weapons powerful, and their soldiers feared across the galaxy. But they had never fought humans before. "How long until they reach Earth?" Sarah asked. 48 hours, Captain," replied the navigation officer. Sarah looked around her bridge. Her crew was young, most of them fresh from the academy. The Indomitable was their first real assignment. It was also humanity's last hope. The ship itself was different from anything else in space. While other races built their vessels to last for centuries, humans built theirs to adapt. The Indomitable could change its weapons, reconfigure its shields, and modify its systems in the middle of a battle. It was like a living thing that could grow and evolve. "Captain Chen, to all hands," Sarah spoke into the ship's communication system. "I know you're all scared. Hell, I'm scared too. We're one ship against an entire fleet. The odds are impossible." She paused, looking at the faces of her bridge crew. They were listening, waiting for her to tell them what to do. "But here's the thing about humans," Sarah continued. "We don't care about impossible odds. Our ancestors climbed out of caves and reached for the stars. They crossed oceans in wooden boats and walked on the moon with computers less powerful than a calculator. We've always done the impossible." The crew straightened up a little. Sarah could see hope returning to their eyes. "The hegemony thinks they know everything about war. They've been fighting the same way for thousands of years, but they've never fought us. They don't know about human stubbornness. They don't know about human creativity. And they sure as hell don't know what happens when you threaten our home." On the screen, more reports came in. The alien fleet was moving fast, destroying everything in its path. Admiral Kethvar, the hegemony's greatest military leader, was in command. He had never lost a battle. Sarah had studied every one of his victories. She knew his tactics, his favorite formations, his standard approaches. That was going to be his weakness. The hegemony always fought the same way. They relied on overwhelming force and proven strategies. Humans were different. They changed tactics in the middle of a fight. They adapted to new situations. They turned weaknesses into strengths. "Mr. Webb, send a message to Earth Command," Sarah ordered. "Tell them we're implementing Protocol Defiance." Webb's eyes went wide. Protocol Defiance was a battle plan that had never been tested. It was considered too risky, too unpredictable. It required a crew willing to do things that no sane military would attempt. "Captain, are you sure?" Webb asked. "Protocol Defiance, it's never been tried in real combat." "That's exactly why it's going to work," Sarah replied. "Send the message." While Webb worked, Sarah thought about the ship beneath her feet. The Indomitable was built using human engineering principles. Where other races made their ships solid and unchanging, humans made theirs flexible. The weapon pods could be ejected and controlled remotely. The shields could adapt to different types of attacks. Even the hull could reconfigure itself if needed. Most importantly, the ship's AI was designed to think like a human. It could make split-second decisions, change plans instantly, and even have hunches. Other races thought this was primitive. They preferred logical, predictable systems. Sarah knew better. Logic was useful, but it could also be a trap. Sometimes the best solution was the one that made no sense to anyone else. "Message sent, Captain," Webb reported. "Good. Now prepare the ship for combat. I want all weapon systems online, but keep them in stealth mode. Let the hegemony think we're just another standard warship." The next 47 hours passed quickly. The crew prepared for battle while Sarah studied the enemy fleet. Admiral Kethvar was doing exactly what she expected. His ships were in perfect formation, following standard hegemony attack patterns. On Earth, billions of people waited. They knew a single human ship was all that stood between them and destruction. Some were afraid, others were angry, but all of them believed in their defenders. Sarah received messages from around the world. Children had drawn pictures of the Indomitable. Soldiers had sent videos of support. Scientists had offered last-minute weapon upgrades, but the message that meant the most came from her own daughter. "Mom, I know you'll find a way. Humans always do. Love you." As the hegemony fleet entered the solar system, Sarah took her position in the captain's chair. The bridge was quiet except for the soft beeping of instruments. "Admiral Kethvar is broadcasting on all frequencies," the communications officer announced. "Put him on screen," Sarah ordered. The view screen flickered, showing a tall alien with gray skin and 4 arms. His uniform was covered in medals from 1,000 victories. His eyes were cold and confident. "Human vessel," Kethvar said, his voice calm and arrogant. "You are greatly outnumbered. Surrender now and your deaths will be quick." Sarah stood up slowly. She looked directly at the alien admiral and smiled. "Admiral, I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force ship Indomitable. I have a message for you." Kethvar tilted his head, curious despite himself. "The message is this," Sarah continued. "You picked the wrong species to mess with." She cut the transmission and turned to her crew. "All right, people, time to show them what humans can do. Mr. Webb, take us directly at their main formation. Full speed." "Captain, that's suicide," Webb protested. "No," Sarah said, settling back into her chair. "That's just Tuesday for a human. Execute the order." The Indomitable turned toward the massive enemy fleet and accelerated. 200 alien ships waited ahead, their weapons charging, their crews confident in their overwhelming advantage. They had no idea what was about to hit them. On the bridge, Sarah watched the tactical display as her ship raced toward certain destruction, or so it appeared. In reality, she was about to teach the galaxy's oldest military minds a lesson about the youngest military force in space. Humans didn't just fight wars. They rewrote the rules of war. The battle for Earth was about to begin, and Admiral Kethvar was about to learn why humans were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The Indomitable raced through space like a silver arrow aimed at the heart of the hegemony fleet. On the bridge, Captain Sarah Chen watched the distance counter drop rapidly. 50,000 kilometers, 40,000, 30,000. "Captain, they're powering up weapons," reported the tactical officer. "All ships are targeting us." Sarah nodded calmly. This was exactly what she wanted. "Mr. Webb, initiate Protocol Defiance, Phase 1. Release all weapon pods, but keep them powered down." Lieutenant Webb's fingers flew over his console. Along the hull of the Indomitable, dozens of small weapon pods detached silently. To the enemy sensors, they looked like debris or equipment failures. Admiral Kethvar watched from his flagship as the human ship approached. He had fought hundreds of different species, and they all followed the same basic rules of space combat. Ships stayed at long range. They fired in formations. They tried to use superior numbers to overwhelm their enemies. But this human ship was doing none of those things. It was charging directly at his fleet like a missile. "Admiral, should we destroy it now?" asked his tactical officer. Kethvar held up one of his 4 hands. "Wait. I want to see what they're planning. One ship cannot harm 200. Let them come closer." It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. 20,000 kilometers. 15,000. 10,000. "Now," Sarah whispered. "Throw." Indomitable suddenly changed direction, diving under the enemy formation instead of charging through it. At the same time, the weapon pods that had been drifting through space came to life. The hegemony fleet found themselves surrounded by dozens of tiny weapons platforms, each one controlled by the Indomitable's advanced AI. The pods opened fire from every direction at once. "What is this?" Kethvar shouted as his ships began taking hits from all sides. His tactical officer was frantically trying to understand what was happening. "Sir, the human ship somehow deployed remote weapons. They're firing independently." But that was only the beginning. The Indomitable's main weapons came online, and they were unlike anything the hegemony had ever seen. Instead of fixed guns that could only fire in one direction, human weapons could rotate, bend, and even reshape themselves during combat. The ship's shields were even more unusual. When a hegemony beam weapon hit them, the shields absorbed the energy and used it to power the ship's own weapons. When plasma torpedoes struck, the shields analyzed the attack and became stronger against that specific weapon. "Impossible," Kethvar muttered. "Shields don't work that way." But human shields did. They were designed by engineers who believed that every attack was also an opportunity to learn and adapt. The first 10 minutes of the battle were chaos. Hegemony ships fired at the Indomitable, only to watch their attacks make the human ship stronger. They tried to target the weapon pods, but the pods moved unpredictably, sometimes even hiding behind enemy ships. Sarah stood calmly in the center of the bridge, watching the tactical display like a chess master studying a board. "Mr. Webb, Phase 2. Target their communication relays." "Aye, Captain." The Indomitable's weapons switched targets. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy ships, they began hitting communication arrays and sensor equipment. Within minutes, the hegemony fleet began losing coordination. This was human warfare at its finest. Other species tried to destroy their enemies through brute force. Humans preferred to confuse, disrupt, and outthink their opponents. "Admiral, we've lost contact with the outer squadrons," reported Kethvar's communications officer. "How is one ship doing this to us?" Kethvar demanded. He was about to find out that humans had more surprises in store. Sarah watched as the enemy fleet began to lose its perfect formation. Ships were drifting out of position, unable to communicate with their commanders. It was time for the next phase. "All hands, prepare for Maneuver 17, she announced. Her crew had trained for months on Maneuver 17. It was considered impossible by every military academy in the galaxy. It required a ship to spin in 3 different directions while firing weapons in 4 different directions and changing course every few seconds. Only a human crew could pull it off, because only humans were crazy enough to try. The Indomitable began spinning like a top while racing through the enemy formation. Its weapons fired in all directions, hitting targets that no computer should have been able to track. The ship's AI worked perfectly with the human crew, each complementing the other's strengths. To the hegemony fleet, it looked like the human ship had suddenly become 5 ships at once. They couldn't track its movements or predict where it would. "Go next! Target that ship!" Kethvar screamed. "All weapons, fire!" 200 ships opened fire at once. Energy beams and missiles filled the space where the Indomitable had been a moment before. But the ship wasn't there anymore. It had somehow moved to a completely different position while continuing to spin and fire. The hegemony weapons hit their own ships instead. Sarah smiled as she watched 6 enemy vessels take damage from friendly fire. "That's the problem with rigid thinking," she said to Webb. "You become predictable." The human ship continued its impossible dance through the enemy fleet. Every few minutes it would change tactics completely. Sometimes it would fight like a heavy battleship, using massive weapons to punch through enemy armor. Sometimes it would fight like a fast fighter, zipping between larger ships and hitting weak points. The hegemony crews were becoming frustrated and confused. They had been trained to fight opponents who followed logical patterns. The human ship seemed to have no pattern at all. But there was a pattern. Sarah was following a strategy that had been developed by human military thinkers over centuries of warfare. It was called adaptive chaos theory, and it was based on a simple idea. If your enemy can't predict what you're going to do, they can't defend against it. After 30 minutes of combat, the hegemony fleet had lost 20 ships and dozens more were damaged. The Indomitable had taken some hits, but its adaptive shields and self-repairing systems kept it fighting at full strength. Kethvar stared at his tactical display in disbelief. He had been trained by the greatest military minds in hegemony history. He had studied warfare for over 2 centuries, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Sir," his tactical officer said quietly, "maybe we should withdraw and regroup." Kethvar's pride flared. "Withdraw? From one ship? Never!" But even as he said it, he knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't how space battles were supposed to work. Ships weren't supposed to spin like dancers while fighting. Weapons weren't supposed to reshape themselves. Shields weren't supposed to learn and adapt. The humans were fighting with technology that seemed almost alive. Worse, they were fighting with a level of creativity that the hegemony had never encountered. On the Indomitable, Sarah checked the battle reports. They were doing better than she had hoped, but the real test was still ahead. So far, they had only faced the outer edges of the enemy fleet. The core ships, with the most experienced crews and the heaviest weapons, were still waiting. "Captain," Webb said, "we're receiving a transmission from the enemy flagship." "Put it on screen." Admiral Kethvar's face appeared, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. "Human captain, what manner of sorcery is this? Your ship defies all logic." Sarah looked at him calmly. "It's not sorcery, Admiral. It's just human engineering. We build our ships to think and adapt, not just follow orders." "Impossible. Machines cannot think. Our machines can. That's what makes us dangerous." Kethvar's eyes narrowed. "One ship cannot defeat an entire fleet, no matter how clever." Sarah smiled. "Admiral, you're about to learn something important about humans. We don't just think outside the box. We throw the box away and build something completely new." She cut the transmission and turned to her crew. The real battle was about to begin. Admiral Kethvar had seen enough. The human ship was making fools of his outer squadrons, dancing through space like it was playing a game instead of fighting a war. It was time to end this humiliation. "All ships, abandon formation," he commanded. "Surround the human vessel from every direction. Use swarm tactics. They cannot fight all of us at once." Across the hegemony fleet, ship captains received their orders. Within minutes, the neat formation that had dominated space battles for centuries dissolved into a massive cloud of warships, all converging on the single human vessel. On the Indomitable, alarms began sounding as sensors detected the change in enemy tactics. "Captain, they're coming at us from all sides," reported the tactical officer. "Over 150 ships are moving to surround us." Sarah Chen studied the tactical display with the calm expression that had made her famous at the Academy. The hegemony was doing exactly what she had hoped they would do. They were abandoning their greatest strength, coordinated formation fighting, to try to overwhelm her with numbers. They didn't understand that the Indomitable had been designed for exactly this situation. "Mr. Webb, signal the engineering teams. Tell them it's time for full reconfiguration." Webb nodded and sent the message. Throughout the ship, engineering teams began working frantically at their stations. The Indomitable was about to reveal its greatest secret. Human ships weren't just built to fight. They were built to become whatever they needed to be. The ship's hull began to shift and change. Weapon pods that had been mounted on the sides moved to new positions. Shield generators reorganized themselves. Even the engine configuration altered, as the ship prepared for a completely different type of combat. In 5 minutes, the Indomitable transformed from a heavy battleship into something that looked more like a massive fighter craft surrounded by a cloud of independent weapon platforms. "Transformation complete," announced Chief Engineer Rodriguez from the engine room. "All systems are green." Admiral Kethvar watched in amazement as the human ship literally changed shape before his eyes. "What are they doing?" he muttered. His tactical officer was equally confused. "Sir, their ship appears to be rebuilding itself." "That's impossible. Ships don't change configuration during battle." But human ships did. They had been designed by engineers who believed that flexibility was more important than raw power. The Indomitable could be a battleship, a carrier, a stealth scout, or a dozen other configurations depending on what the situation required. The swarm of hegemony ships reached attack range and opened fire. Energy beams and missiles filled space as over 100 vessels attacked the lone human ship simultaneously. Sarah watched calmly as the attacks approached. "Now," she said quietly. The Indomitable's new configuration came to life. Instead of trying to absorb or deflect the incoming fire, the ship began to move like a living thing. It twisted, spun, and flowed through space, avoiding most of the attacks while its own weapons fired back. But the real surprise was what happened to the attacks that did hit. The ship's adaptive shielding didn't just absorb the energy from enemy weapons. It analyzed each attack, learned from it, and then used that information to predict and counter future attacks of the same type. After the first volley, the Indomitable was already adapting to hegemony weapons. After the second volley, it was countering them. After the third, it was turning them against their creators. "Impossible," Kethvar breathed as he watched his own ship's weapons being redirected back at them. But for humans, impossible was just another word for engineering challenge. The battle became a swirling chaos of ships, weapons, and explosions. The hegemony vessels tried to maintain their swarm formation, but the human ship was moving too unpredictably. It would suddenly appear in the middle of a group of enemy ships, fire in all directions, then disappear before they could respond. Sarah's crew worked with the smooth efficiency that came from months of training together. They didn't just follow orders, they anticipated what needed to be done and did it without being asked. When the navigation system was damaged by enemy fire, the pilots switched to manual control without missing a beat. When the main computer, overloaded from processing too much tactical data, the crew began calculating targeting solutions by hand. This was human warfare at its purest. When their technology failed, humans didn't give up. They improvised, adapted, and found new ways to fight. "Captain, we're getting reports from all over the fleet," Webb announced. "Enemy ships are colliding with each other. They can't maintain formation while trying to track us." Sarah nodded. This was another advantage of human tactical thinking. They had studied every major space battle in galactic history, and they had noticed something that other species missed. Large formations were vulnerable to chaos. When ships tried to swarm a single target, they often ended up getting in each other's way. If the target moved unpredictably enough, the attackers would start hitting each other instead. The Indomitable was moving very unpredictably indeed. "Sir, we've lost 12 more ships," reported Kethvar's tactical officer. "Most of them from collisions with our own forces." Kethvar's 4 hands clenched into fists. This was becoming a disaster. His fleet was being torn apart by a single ship that seemed to defy every law of physics and military strategy. "How are they doing this?" he demanded. His science officer, who had been quietly studying the human ship's behavior, spoke up hesitantly. "Admiral, I believe they're using what humans call chaos theory. They're creating intentional disorder to disrupt our coordinated attacks." Chaos theory? That's not a military strategy. For humans, it appears to be. On the Indomitable, Sarah was indeed using chaos theory, but she was also using something even more powerful: human intuition. Every few minutes, she would give orders that made no logical sense, but somehow worked perfectly. "Take us through that asteroid field," she commanded. "Captain, there is no asteroid field in this sector," Webb replied. "There will be in 30 seconds. Trust me." She was right. The Indomitable raced toward what looked like empty space, but was actually the debris field from destroyed enemy ships. The pieces of metal and machinery created a maze that the larger hegemony vessels couldn't navigate safely. The human ship, with its smaller size and incredible maneuverability, wove through the debris like a dolphin swimming through kelp. The enemy ships that tried to follow became tangled up and started hitting each other again. "This is insane," muttered one of Kethavar's officers. "They're using our own destroyed ships as weapons against us." But the Indomitable wasn't finished yet. As it moved through the debris field, it began collecting pieces of destroyed enemy ships and incorporating them into its own structure. Human engineering teams worked frantically to adapt alien technology to their own systems. Within an hour, the human ship was firing weapons that had been salvaged from destroyed hegemony vessels, but modified to work in ways their original designers had never intended. Kethavar watched in horror as his own technology was turned against him in ways he couldn't have imagined. The humans weren't just adapting to his weapons. They were improving them and using them better than his own crews could. "Admiral, perhaps we should consider retreat," suggested his second-in-command. "Retreat?" Kethavar's voice was dangerous. "From one ship? Never." But even as he said it, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't really one ship anymore. It was something else entirely. The humans had turned the battle itself into a weapon, using everything around them, debris, energy fields, even his own ships, as part of their arsenal. The Indomitable had stopped being just a warship. It had become something alive, something that grew and changed and learned from every moment of combat. And it was winning. Sarah looked at the tactical display and allowed herself a small smile. They had destroyed or disabled over 60 enemy ships, and the rest were in complete disarray. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. Admiral Kethavar still had over 100 ships left, and he was about to make his final, desperate play. "All hands," she announced. "Prepare for Phase 4. Things are about to get really interesting." Admiral Kethavar stood in his command center, watching his fleet fall apart around him. 60 ships destroyed, dozens more damaged, all by a single human vessel that seemed to break every rule of space combat. But now he understood something that chilled him to his core. The humans weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to win. And they were winning. "Admiral," his tactical officer said quietly, "the outer squadrons are requesting permission to withdraw." Kethavar's eyes blazed with fury. "No retreat! Any captain who tries to flee will be destroyed by my personal guard." He turned to study the battle display. The human ship was still dancing through space, still adapting and changing with every passing moment. But Kethavar had finally figured out what made it so dangerous. The humans didn't just adapt to circumstances. They thrived on chaos. Every setback made them stronger. Every challenge made them more creative. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. On the Indomitable, Captain Sarah Chen was having the same realization from the opposite perspective. Her crew had pushed their ship beyond every theoretical limit, and it was still performing perfectly. Engineers were rebuilding damaged systems while under fire. Gunners were manually targeting weapons when computers failed. The entire ship was working like a living organism. "Captain," Chief Engineer Rodriguez called from the engine room, "we're running at 130% of rated capacity. The ship shouldn't be able to handle this much stress." "But it is handling it," Sarah replied. "That's the difference between human engineering and everyone else's. We don't build things to work under ideal conditions. We build them to work when everything goes wrong." She looked around the bridge at her crew. They were exhausted, covered in sweat and grime from hours of intense combat. But their eyes were bright with determination. They were doing the impossible, and they knew it. "Mr. Webb, how many enemy ships are still operational?" 112, Captain. "But they're scattered and disorganized." Sarah studied the tactical display. The remaining hegemony ships were still dangerous, but they had lost their coordination. They were fighting like individual vessels instead of a unified fleet. That gave her an idea. A crazy, impossible idea that no sane military commander would ever attempt. "Mr. Webb, send a message to engineering. Tell them to prepare the capture pods. Webb's eyes went wide. Captain, did you say capture pods? You heard me. We're not going to destroy the rest of their fleet. We're going to take it. The bridge fell silent. Everyone stared at their captain as if she had lost her mind. Captain, Webb said carefully, capturing enemy ships during battle is, well, it's never been done before. That's exactly why it's going to work, Sarah replied. Admiral Kethvar has been fighting wars for centuries. He knows how to deal with enemy ships that want to destroy him. He has no idea how to deal with enemy ships that want to steal his fleet. She turned to address the entire crew. Listen up, everyone. We're about to attempt something that's never been tried in the history of space warfare. We're going to capture an entire enemy fleet while it's still shooting at us. In the engine room, Chief Rodriguez received the orders and shook his head in amazement. Only humans would try something this crazy, he muttered to his team. All right, people. You heard the captain. Prep the capture pods. The capture pods were another example of human engineering innovation. Other races built boarding shuttles that were heavily armored and designed to force their way onto enemy ships. Humans built capture pods that looked like pieces of debris until they attached to an enemy hull. Once attached, the pods would bore through the hull using molecular disassemblers and release boarding teams armed with non-lethal weapons designed to disable crews without damaging ships. The Indomitable suddenly changed tactics again. Instead of trying to destroy enemy vessels, it began deploying capture pods while engaging in what looked like a fighting retreat. Admiral Kethvar watched the change in human behavior with confusion. What are they doing now? Why are they pulling back? Sir, we're detecting some kind of debris field trailing behind their ship, reported his sensor officer. Debris? From what? Unknown, sir. The pieces are too small to identify. Kethvar was about to find out that the debris was actually dozens of capture pods drifting through space, waiting for enemy ships to come close enough. The first hegemony vessel to encounter a capture pod was the heavy cruiser Domination. The pod attached to the ship's hull so quietly that the crew didn't even notice. Within minutes, human boarding teams were inside the ship, using stun weapons and sleep gas to disable the crew. Sir, we've lost contact with the Domination, reported. Kethvar's communications officer, lost contact? What do you mean? They're not responding to any signals, but the ship is still showing as operational on sensors. Similar reports began coming in from across the fleet. Ships were going silent one by one, but they weren't being destroyed. They were just stopping. Kethvar began to understand what was happening, and the realization filled him with horror. They're not destroying our ships. They're capturing them. That's impossible, sir. You can't capture ships during active combat. The humans can, Kethvar said grimly. They're rewriting the rules of warfare as they fight. On the Indomitable, Sarah watched with satisfaction as more and more enemy vessels fell under human control. Her boarding teams were made up of volunteers who had trained for months in zero-gravity combat and ship infiltration. But what made them truly effective was their equipment. Human boarding gear was designed to be non-destructive. Instead of blasting their way through enemy ships, they used tools that could bypass any security system and weapons that disabled rather than killed. Captain, we now control 17 enemy vessels, Webb reported. Our boarding teams are securing their crews and taking control of their systems. Excellent. How many of our people have been lost? None, Captain. The non-lethal approach is working perfectly. Enemy crews are surrendering rather than fighting to the death. This was another aspect of human psychological warfare. When faced with opponents who could have killed them but chose not to, many enemy soldiers lost the will to fight. It was hard to hate someone who was trying to capture you instead of murder you. Admiral Kethvar found himself facing a situation that no military academy in the galaxy had prepared him for. His ships were being stolen in the middle of a battle, and there was nothing in his tactical training that told him how to respond. Sir, the humans are broadcasting a message, announced his communications officer. Put it on screen. Captain Sarah. Chen's face appeared on the display. She looked calm and confident, not at all like someone who was fighting against impossible odds. Admiral Kethvar, she said, I want to make you an offer. Surrender now, and your crews will be treated as prisoners of war. Keep fighting, and I'll capture your ships one by one until you have nothing left. Kethvar's 4 hands clenched into fists. You think you can capture my entire fleet? Admiral, I've already captured 23 of your ships. Your fleet is scattered, demoralized, and confused. Most of your crews are more afraid of my boarding teams than they are of death itself. She paused, letting that sink in. But here's what really should scare you, Sarah continued. My ship is getting stronger with every vessel we capture. We're learning your technology, adapting your weapons, and turning your own fleet against you. In another hour, I won't just have one ship. I'll have 50 ships, all of them improved by human engineering. Kethvar stared at the screen in growing horror. She was right. Every captured vessel was being quickly modified by human engineering teams. They were taking hegemony technology and making it better. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No, Admiral," Sarah replied. "This is just humans being human. We don't accept defeat. We don't follow the rules. And we certainly don't know when to. Quit." She cut the transmission, leaving Kethvar staring at a blank screen. Around him, his officers waited for orders. But for the first time in his long military career, Admiral Kethvar had no idea what to do. He was facing an enemy that captured ships instead of destroying them, that improved technology instead of just using it, and that seemed to get stronger. With every attack, he was facing humanity at war, and he was finally beginning to understand why they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Admiral Kethvar stood alone in his command center, watching his once mighty fleet crumble around him. 57 ships had been captured by the humans. Another 20 had been destroyed. The remaining vessels were scattered across space, their crews too terrified to fight effectively. In 4 hours of combat, a single human ship had accomplished what should have been impossible. It had not just survived against overwhelming odds, it had turned those odds upside down. "Sir," his tactical officer said quietly, "we're receiving surrender requests from 12 more captains." Kethvar closed his eyes. His fleet commanders, warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds, were giving up rather than face the human boarding teams. They had seen what happened to captured vessels. The humans improved them, made them faster and stronger, then used them against their former allies. "Admiral," his communications officer announced, "the human ship is broadcasting on all frequencies." "Let me hear it." Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the command center. But she wasn't speaking to Kethvar. She was talking directly to his crews. "Attention all hegemony personnel," Sarah said, her voice calm and reasonable. "Your admiral has led you into a battle you cannot win. Your ships are being captured one by one. Your companions are surrendering rather than die for no reason." Kethvar tried to cut off the transmission, but somehow the humans had taken control of his own communication systems. "I'm offering you a choice," Sarah continued. "Surrender now, and you'll be treated with respect. Your ships will be returned to you eventually, and your crews will go home to their families. Keep fighting, and more of you will die for nothing." Across the fleet, hegemony crews listened to the human captain's words. Many of them had been soldiers for decades, but they had never faced an enemy like this. The humans didn't just want to defeat them, they wanted to capture them, improve their ships, and send them home better than they had arrived. It was completely outside their understanding of warfare. On the Indomitable, Sarah studied the tactical display with satisfaction. Her plan was working better than she had hoped. The enemy fleet was falling apart, not through destruction, but through demoralization. "Captain," Lieutenant Webb reported, "we're detecting multiple ships powering down their weapons. I think they're surrendering." "How many?" 23 and counting. Sarah nodded. This was the power of psychological warfare combined with superior technology. When your enemy couldn't predict your actions and couldn't match your capabilities, they eventually lost the will to fight. But Admiral Kethvar still had his flagship and a core group of loyal vessels. He wasn't going to surrender easily. "Mr. Webb, prepare a boarding team for the enemy flagship. I'm going to personally accept Admiral Kethvar's surrender." Webb stared at her. "Captain, you're going to board the enemy flagship? That's incredibly dangerous." "Mr. Webb, I've spent the last 4 hours doing incredibly dangerous things." "Why stop now?" 20 minutes later, Sarah Chen stood in the docking bay of the Indomitable, checking her equipment one final time. She wore light armor and carried non-lethal weapons, the same gear used by all human boarding teams. Behind her, a team of elite Marines waited for orders. They had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission, boarding an enemy flagship while it was still capable of fighting. "Remember," Sarah told her team, "we're not here to conquer. We're here to end this war with as little bloodshed as possible. Admiral Kethvar is a proud warrior. We need to give him a way to surrender with honor." The boarding shuttle detached from the Indomitable and raced toward the enemy flagship. Kethvar's ship was massive, over 1 kilometer long and bristling with weapons. It could have destroyed the small shuttle with a single shot, but the weapons remained silent. Even Kethvar was curious to see what the human captain would do next. The shuttle docked with the flagship's main bay. Sarah and her team emerged to find themselves surrounded by hundreds of armed hegemony soldiers. The weapons were pointed at them, but nobody was shooting. Admiral Kethvar himself stood at the front of the group. He was even more imposing in person, his 4 arms and tall frame making him look like a warrior from ancient legends. "Captain Chen," he said formally. "You have made a grave mistake coming here." Sarah removed her helmet and looked directly at him. "Admiral, I came here to offer you something that no one has ever offered you before." "And what is that?" "A chance to surrender with honor. A chance to save the lives of your remaining crews. A chance to learn something new about warfare." Kethvar's eyes narrowed. "I have been fighting wars since before your species reached the stars. What could you possibly teach me?" Sarah smiled. "I can teach you that winning doesn't always mean destroying your enemy. Sometimes it means showing them a better way." She gestured toward a large view screen that showed the space around them. Captured hegemony ships were visible in the distance, but they hadn't been stripped or damaged. Human engineering teams were working on them, but they were improving the vessels, not dismantling them. "Your ships are being made better," Sarah continued. "Your crews are being treated well. When this war is over, they'll go home with technology that's more advanced than what they started with." Kethvar stared at the display in confusion. "Why would you do this? Why improve our ships if you're our enemy?" "Because we're not really enemies, Admiral. We're just two species who got into a misunderstanding. Humans don't want to conquer the galaxy. We just want to be left alone to explore and learn and grow." She paused, looking around at the assembled soldiers. "But when someone threatens our home, we'll fight with everything we have. We'll adapt, improvise, and do things that seem impossible. Not because we're warriors, but because we're survivors." Admiral Kethvar was silent for a long moment. Around him, his soldiers waited for orders. The tension in the bay was thick enough to cut. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Chen, in 4 hours you have destroyed my fleet, captured my ships, and turned my own technology against me. You have done things that should be impossible." "Yes, sir. Why should I surrender to you? Why should I trust you?" Sarah stepped closer to him, ignoring the weapons pointed at her. "Because, Admiral, I'm going to give you something that the hegemony has never had before." "Which is?" "A second chance. Surrender now, and your empire can learn new ways of doing things. Your ships will be returned to you improved. Your crews will go home with new knowledge. Your civilization will become stronger, not weaker." She spread her arms wide, addressing all the soldiers in the bay. "Or you can keep fighting, and I'll capture every ship you have. Either way, this war is over. The only question is whether it ends with honor or with humiliation." Kethvar looked around at his soldiers. He could see it in their eyes. They were ready to surrender. They had seen what the humans could do, and they didn't want to fight anymore. But more than that, they were curious. The humans had shown them technology and tactics they had never imagined. They wanted to learn more. Slowly, Admiral Kethvar reached for his ceremonial sword. For a moment, Sarah thought he might attack. Instead, he placed the weapon on the deck at her feet. "I, Admiral Kethvar of the Hegemony Grand Fleet, surrender to Captain Sarah Chen of the human ship Indomitable." A cheer went up from the human Marines, but Sarah held up her hand for silence. "Admiral, your surrender is accepted with honor. Your crews will be treated as guests, not prisoners. Your ships will be returned to you improved and upgraded. And when you go home, you'll carry a message of peace from humanity to the hegemony leadership." 3 hours later, the impossible battle was finally over. The hegemony Grand Fleet, or what was left of it, was under human control. Not through destruction, but through capture and conversion. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, looking out at the dozens of ships that now flew human flags. Her crew was exhausted but victorious. They had done the impossible. "Captain," Webb said, "we're receiving messages from Earth. The news of our victory is spreading across human space." Sarah smiled. "Good. Make sure they know that we won this battle not by being the strongest, but by being the most adaptable." She turned to look at the tactical display one more time. The red dots that had once represented an overwhelming enemy force were now blue dots representing human allies. In one battle, humanity had gone from being a minor species on the edge of extinction to a major power in galactic politics. And they had done it by proving that sometimes the best way to win a war was to show your enemies a better way to live. The age of human dominance in space hadn't begun with conquest or destruction. It had begun with a single ship, a brave crew, and the human refusal to accept defeat. Admiral Kethvar, now a guest aboard the Indomitable, stood beside Sarah and watched the peaceful fleet. "Captain," he said quietly, "you have taught me something I never expected to learn." "What's that, Admiral?" "That true strength isn't about how much you can destroy. It's about how much you can build." Sarah nodded. Welcome to the human way of thinking, Admiral. I think you're going to like it here. In the distance, Earth shone like a blue jewel against the darkness of space. The home of humanity was safe, and the galaxy had learned something new about what humans could accomplish when they set their minds to it. The Indomitable had lived up to its name. It had been indomitable not just in battle, but in its refusal to accept that war had to end in